The mirror didn't lie, but the woman standing in front of it did. My name is Elias Thorne, and for a decade I was the king of Oak Creek, Illinois. I built skyscrapers that pierced the Chicago clouds, but I couldn't see the cracks forming in my own living room. That evening, the air in our master suite was thick with the scent of Chanel No. 5 and unspoken resentment. I watched Clara, my wife of 10 years, trace the outline of her lips with a lipstick the color of a fresh wound. She was wearing a floor-length emerald silk gown that seemed to shimmer like a serpent's skin under the soft glow of the recessed lighting. I approached her, my hand reaching out to touch the small of her back, a gesture of affection that had once been second nature. She didn't just move away. She recoiled. It was a sharp, jagged flinch that she immediately tried to cover with a tight, artificial smile. "Careful, Elias," she whispered, her voice as cold as the Lake Michigan wind. "I don't want to ruin the silhouette." The silhouette. That's what our marriage had become, an outline with nothing inside. I felt a hollow ache in my chest, a primal instinct screaming that the woman I loved was already gone, replaced by a high-definition stranger. Before we go deeper into this story, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. Here on Family Secrets and Revenge, we know that the most beautiful homes often hide the ugliest truths. I looked at my reflection behind hers. I looked like a man who had everything: the custom Italian suit, the gold watch that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, the respect of every developer in the tri-state area. But as I looked into Clara's eyes through the glass, I realized I was looking at a predator who had already picked her next meal. The silence between us wasn't peaceful, it was a countdown. The 60-minute drive to the Miller's annual gala was a masterclass in psychological warfare. We sat in my German luxury sedan, the leather seats smelling of success and failure. I tried to bridge the gap. I talked about the Sterling Heights project, the $3 billion development that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of Thorne Industries. I mentioned the security upgrades I'd implemented, specifically the new encryption keys stored in my private floor safe. "The safe behind your father's portrait?" Clara asked. It was the first time she'd shown interest in my work in months. Her eyes remained fixed on the dark, blurring cornfields of northern Illinois, but her posture shifted. She was listening now, really listening. "Yes," I replied, a sense of unease crawling up my spine like a spider. "The codes are unique. Without them, the entire digital infrastructure of the project is a paperweight. It's the only thing keeping the predatory firms like Vane International from gutting us during the bidding phase." Clara nodded slowly, her fingers tapping a rhythmic, nervous beat against her silk clutch. "It's good to be careful, Elias. In this city, people would kill for a shortcut like that." She said it with a lightness that felt heavy, a paradox that I couldn't quite untangle in the moment. I reached for her hand, but she pulled it away to check her phone. The screen's blue light washed over her face, turning her features into a pale digital mask. She was texting someone. I didn't ask who. I was too afraid of the answer. The Miller estate was a monstrosity of glass, steel, and ego perched on the jagged cliffs of Lake Michigan. As we pulled into the winding driveway, lined with flickering gas torches, the house looked less like a home and more like a fortress. This was the Masquerade Gala, a night where the elite of Chicago gathered to pretend they weren't all trying to destroy one another. The valet opened Clara's door, and she stepped out with a grace that made the photographer's bulbs go into a frenzy. I followed, feeling like an accessory to my own life. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of velvet masks and expensive champagne. The music was a low, pulsing cello arrangement that felt like it was vibrating in my teeth. "Elias, the man of the hour," Arthur Miller boomed, clapping a hand on my shoulder. Arthur was a shark in a tuxedo, a man who had made his fortune in distressed assets. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive gin. "I hear Vane is looking to make a move on Sterling Heights. You better keep your doors locked, my friend." I scanned the room, looking for the man who had haunted my professional life for a decade, and then I saw him. Julian Vane. He was standing by the marble fireplace, surrounded by a group of young, hungry-looking associates. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need one. His face was already a permanent expression of arrogance. I watched as Julian's eyes locked onto Clara. It wasn't the look of a casual acquaintance. Sure, it was the look of a man who was checking the time on a watch he'd already stolen. Clara didn't look away. She didn't flush with embarrassment. She gave him a slow, deliberate nod, a signal that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. "I need a drink," Clara whispered, not looking at me. She drifted away into the crowd, her emerald dress disappearing into the kaleidoscope of masks. I tried to follow her, but I was intercepted by a city councilman who wanted to discuss zoning permits. I stood there nodding and smiling, my eyes frantically searching the ballroom. I felt a cold sweat breaking out under my collar. I finally broke away and headed toward the bar, but she wasn't there. I checked the terrace, the library, the gallery. Nothing. The house was a labyrinth of hidden corners and private alcoves. When I walked toward the rear of the estate, where the floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the dark, churning water of the lake, in the reflection of the glass, I saw two figures standing in the shadows of the garden. One was wearing emerald silk. The other was tall, broad-shouldered, and unmistakable. Julian Vane had his hand on the small of my wife's back. Not where I had reached for her, but lower, more intimate. They weren't talking. They were planning. I moved toward the French doors, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would crack. But by the time I stepped out into the biting October air, the garden was empty. I ran toward the valet station at the front of the house. The mist was thick, smelling of salt and ozone. "Mr. Thorne?" the valet asked, looking confused. "Is everything all right?" "My wife," I gasped. "Arbray, did you see where she went?" The young man pointed toward the end of the driveway, where the red taillights of a sleek, black Italian sports car were fading into the fog. "She left with Mr. Vane, sir. She said she wouldn't be coming home." The words hit me like a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis. I stood there surrounded by the luxury of the Miller estate, feeling like a beggar. She hadn't been kidnapped. She hadn't been coerced. She had simply stepped into another man's life and left me holding the bill for a decade of lies. Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. If you were Elias, standing on that driveway while your wife drove off with your biggest rival, what would your first move be? Would you call the police? Or would you head straight for the safe? The drive back to Oak Creek was a blur. I don't remember the roads or the traffic. I only remember the silence. When I walked through the front door of our home, the silence was even louder. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, every architectural detail I had sweated over felt like a mockery. This house wasn't a home. It was a museum of a dead relationship. I went straight to my study. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely input the code into the keypad. I moved the portrait of my father, the man who had started Thorne Industries with nothing but a toolbox and a dream, and looked at the safe. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. I pulled it open. The velvet-lined interior was empty. The hard drives containing the encryption keys for Sterling Heights were gone. Wait, the physical backups, the biometric logs, the legal deeds. Everything Julian Vane needed to dismantle my company was in my wife's emerald clutch. I sat on the floor of the dark office and laughed. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was the sound of a man who had finally realized he was the punchline of a very long joke. I didn't call the police. The police were for people who still had something to lose. I called Silas. Silas Vance was a name whispered in the dark corners of the Chicago Board of Trade. He was a recovery specialist, a man who operated in the gray areas where the law didn't dare to go. My father had used him once to handle a union strike that had turned violent. "Elias," Silas's voice was like gravel being crushed in a tin can. "It's 3 in the morning. This better be about a death or a heist." "Both, Silas," I said, in my voice finally steadying. "My wife is gone, and she took the Sterling Heights keys with her. She's with Julian Vane." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the flick of a lighter. "Vane is a predator, Elias. But your wife, she's the one who's really dangerous. A woman who can play a part for 10 years isn't just a thief, she's an operative. Meet me at the Shipyard Diner in an hour. Bring whatever documents you have left." The shipyard diner was a greasy spoon that smelled of diesel and desperation. Silas was sitting in a corner booth, wearing a nondescript gray jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He looked like every other dock worker, which was exactly why he was so good at what he did. "I've been running some digital diagnostics," Silas said, sliding a tablet across the sticky table. "Your wife didn't just take the keys tonight. She's been accessing your server logs from a burner phone for 18 months. She's been mapping your habits, your security rotations, and your financial vulnerabilities. Julian Vane didn't seduce her, Elias. They've been partners since the day you broke ground on Sterling Heights." I felt a coldness settle into my bones that no amount of coffee could warm. 18 months of "I love you," 18 months of planning our future, 18 months of her watching me sleep, waiting for the right moment to gut me. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in my story and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that a person you trusted was actually playing a long game against you? "Where are they?" I asked, in my voice a low growl. "They're at Vane's private penthouse in the West Loop," Silas replied, "but they won't stay there long. I've traced a high-speed data transfer originating from that location. They're trying to move the encryption keys to an offshore server in the Caymans. Once that data leaves the U.S. jurisdiction, Thorne Industries is effectively bankrupt. You won't even be able to pay your janitors by Monday morning." I looked out the window at the dark silhouettes of the shipping cranes. They looked like giant insects waiting to feast on the remains of the city. "Can we stop the transfer?" Silas cracked a grim smile. "We can't stop it from the outside. Vane's firewall is military grade. But if someone gets inside that penthouse and plugs a physical bypass into the main terminal, I can not only stop the transfer, I can mirror it. I can take everything Vane has." The West Loop was a neighborhood of converted warehouses and multi-million-dollar lofts. Vane's building was a fortress of glass and steel with 24-hour security. But Silas knew the building's architect, a man who had a gambling problem and a very loose tongue. "There's a freight elevator used for furniture deliveries that bypasses the main lobby," Silas whispered into my earpiece as I stood in the dark alleyway. "The code is 4921. You have 3 minutes before the security sweep hits the basement level. Elias, if you get caught, I don't know you." I moved through the shadows, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my chest. I wasn't a soldier, I was a developer. But as I punched the code into the keypad and the heavy steel door hissed open, I felt a surge of cold, focused rage. I wasn't doing this for the money. I was doing this for the 10 years they had stolen from me. The penthouse was a masterpiece of minimalist arrogance. White marble, black leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city Clara and Julian thought they had conquered. I slipped through the darkened living room, my footsteps silent on the deep pile carpet. I heard voices coming from the glass-walled study. Julian's laughter, sharp and jagged, and then Clara's. It was a different laugh than the one she used with me. It was predatory. It was the laugh of a winner. "He actually thought I loved the house in Oak Creek," Clara said, her voice dripping with disdain. "He thought I wanted to grow old in that suburban tomb. He's so predictable, Julian. He's a builder who doesn't realize he's been living in a demolition zone." I stood in the shadows, clutching the bypass device Silas had given me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the walls down. But I waited. I watched as Julian leaned over the terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. "Almost there, darling. 5 more minutes and Thorne Industries is just a memory. We'll be in St. Bart's by sunrise." I didn't wait for the 5 minutes. I stepped into the light of the study. Julian jumped back, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy glass decanter on the desk. Clara froze, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and immediate, cold calculation. "Elias," she whispered, "how did you—" "You always said I was predictable, Clara," I said, my voice steady, sounding like a stranger's. "But you forgot one thing about builders. And we know where the structural flaws are. I didn't come here to take the keys back. I came here to watch you use them." Julian sneered, regaining his composure. "You're too late, Thorne. The transfer is 90% complete. You can't stop it now. In 60 seconds, I own Sterling Heights, and you own a mountain of debt." Go ahead, Julian, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Press the button. Complete the transfer. Watching Elias stand there, letting his enemy win, is a moment of pure psychological tension. If you were in Julian's shoes, would you trust the man you just betrayed? Or would you hesitate? Share your thoughts in the comments. Julian didn't hesitate. He was too arrogant, too blinded by the prospect of the kill. He slammed his finger onto the enter key. The screen flashed green, then amber, then a deep blood red. E-transfer complete, the computer voice chimed. But instead of a success message, the screen began to scroll lines of raw code at a blinding speed. Julian's face went pale. What is this? What did you do? I knew you were watching the server logs, Clara, I said, walking toward the terminal. I knew you were tracing the encryption keys. So I created a second set, a honeypot set. The keys you just transferred aren't for Sterling Heights. They're a Trojan horse. Right now, that data is bypassing your firewall and giving Silas Vance full administrative access to every account Vane International owns. You didn't just steal my company, Julian. You just gave me yours. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara looked at the screen, then at me. The predator realized she was the prey. Julian lunged at me. But the doors to the penthouse burst open. It wasn't Silas. It was the FBI. They had been tipped off by Silas hours ago, using the very data Clara had stolen as evidence of corporate espionage and money laundering. Julian Vane, Clara Thorne, you're under arrest, the lead agent barked. I watched as the zip ties were tightened around Clara's wrists, the same wrists I had adorned with diamond bracelets for a decade. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. Elias, please. He forced me. He threatened me. I did it for us. No, Clara, I said, leaning in close so only she could hear. You did it for the silhouette, and now the light is gone. I watched them be led away. I stood in the center of the penthouse, the city lights shimmering below me like a sea of fallen stars. I felt no joy. I felt no triumph. I only felt a profound, exhausting sense of peace. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal depositions, forensic accounting, and the slow, painful dismantling of Vane International. I didn't keep Julian's company. I sold it piece by piece and used the proceeds to establish a trust for the employees who had been caught in the crossfire of his greed. I sold the house in Oak Creek. I sold the German car. I sold the gold watch. I realized that the things I had used to define my success were the very things that had made me a target. I moved to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, a place where the skyscrapers are made of cedar and Douglas fir. I started a small contracting firm. I build houses now, real houses, houses where people actually live, where the foundations are made of concrete, not secrets. I spend my days with a hammer in my hand and the smell of sawdust in my lungs. It's an honest life, a quiet life. I still think about that night at the Miller Gala. I think about the emerald dress and the black Italian car. I realize now that Clara didn't leave me that night. She had left me years ago. I was just the last person to find out. Betrayal is a fire. It can either consume you or it can forge you into something stronger. I chose to be forged. I lost my wife, my company, and my status. But I found my soul. And in the end, that was a fair trade. If you were in Elias's shoes, starting over with nothing but your dignity and a small toolkit, would you feel like you won? Or would the weight of the past still feel too heavy? Share your thoughts in the comments. On our channel, Family Secrets and Revenge, we often focus on the explosive moments of retribution. But the real revenge isn't the jail time or the financial ruin. The real revenge is living a life that they can no longer touch. Clara writes to me from prison sometimes. I don't open the letters. I don't need to know what she has to say. Her silence was the most honest thing she ever gave me, and I'm finally at peace with it. The story of Elias Thorne isn't a tragedy. It's a blueprint for how to survive when the walls come down and the roof caves in. You don't scream, you don't beg. You just pick up a hammer and start again. Thank you for spending this hour with me. This story is a deeply personal one, a reminder that the people we think we know are often the ones we understand the least. Life can change in the span of a single party. Ariane and the person leaving with another man might just be the best thing that ever happened to you. I would love to hear your overall thoughts based on my story. Did Elias handle the betrayal with the right amount of cold calculation? Or was he too harsh on a woman he once loved? Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the comments below. If you found this narrative gripping and want more deep dives into the dark side of human relationships, please hit that like button and subscribe to Family Secrets and Revenge. Share this video with someone who needs to know that there is life after the collapse. I read every single one of your comments, and your support is what keeps this channel alive. Until next time, remember, the foundation is everything. Watch your back and keep your secrets even closer.